Hello, and welcome back to the Patriska YouTube channel. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Marcus Vincent, and we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to start a new series looking at the pre-canonical or the Marcionite text and the canonical text of St. Paul's letters. And we're going to go through them one by one with particular reference to a concordance that was published last year by Marcus, link down in the description on Amazon if you want to buy it. And we're going to look deeper as to the differences between these texts and what significant features make the Marcionite versions stand out so much. So if you're interested in learning more about the differences between the pre-canonical and canonical texts, then please do like and subscribe to show your support that this is a series you want to see, and that if you subscribe, you'll get regular notifications when we're uploading about these texts. Also, as a small bit of housekeeping, Marcus's computer is going through a bit of a breakdown at the moment, and so you may hear the odd beep from time to time. So, with that out of the way, Marcus, take it away. What have you got for us?
Yeah, thanks very much, and welcome also from my side. This is a venture which we are starting today to talk about, which has a certain incubation time. And that shows in the book which we've just showing here, which is called the Concordance to the Pre-Canonical and Canonical New Testament. Now, what is that about? It is the tool which I have developed when I started working on the reconstruction, first of the Gospel and then of the 10 Pauline letters of Paul. So that goes way back about 15 years. And when I worked on the reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel, I had come across a colleague, namely Matthias Klinghardt. I also had come across, of course, all the other colleagues who, in the meantime, have done reconstructions. I mean, Dieter Roth, for example, and then also scholars like Julius Lieu. She hasn't produced her own reconstruction, but she has written a fantastic book about Marcion. And just like Sebastian, who has also written, I can't remember his second name, but we'll come back, who has written on Marcion the heretic. Anyway, all these people have done fantastic work, and we wouldn't have believed way back when I worked on these texts in the early years of 2000 that we would have a renaissance of Marcion studies. And I still remember when in 2008 I have read Matthias Klinghardt's article, where for the first time he ventured that Luke might be a rewriting of Marcion's Gospel rather than the other way around. I had invited him for a patristics conference in 2011 to Oxford, because I thought with my ideas, which went in a similar direction, although I wasn't yet as far as he was. I was still working on the idea of Christ's resurrection at the time. So I thought I invite colleagues who know more than me and bring them together to a seminar. And here we were in 2011 or 10 in the Oxford School of Examination and had this seminar together. And I remember still vividly that Matthias was adamant that indeed Luke is a rewriting according to his own findings, but still he was at least as adamant by promoting and stating that Mark would be the oldest gospel, so that this Marcionite gospel would go back to an earlier gospel which existed before that time. Now, time passed. We didn't see each other for about 5 years. He was quicker than I was. So he published in 2015 his reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel. And what I have to say, Jason Bedoun was even quicker than all of us, because 2 years earlier, Jason Bedoun had also reconstructed Marcion's Gospel and Marcion's collection of Paul's letters. However, not in the Greek original text reconstructed, but in at least an English translation with extensive, very important commentaries and notes. Fantastic introduction. So I still can recommend Jason Bedoun's work, and we had Jason himself on the channel. So he's a very good colleague, and this shows that despite of sometimes having some differences of opinions, all of these people know each other, as I think all the people in the 2nd century knew each other. And just like in those times then, I think in our times today, we are working together. Yes, we are sometimes of different opinions, but I hope, at least from my side, I can tell that there is no opinion chiseled in stone. None of it. And this shows how much we are dependent on each other, because this is a vast field, a field that covers several languages and a span of time. So if I were to do it on my own, as you have seen, you hear the beep, I had not achieved what we were jointly able to achieve. Now, after Matthias, Jason Bedoun, and then Dieter Roth had all come up within a very short span of time with 3 options how to reconstruct Marcion's Gospel. And we have to add, in those years then, also Mark Bilby had come up with an online reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel. So we have, let's say, at least 4 reconstructions within less than a decade of Marcion's Gospel. Now one could state and draw the conclusion, well, you can't reconstruct it because we have so many differences. And this is partly right, but mostly wrong. Why is it wrong? The substantial amount of overlaps and harmonized views between those 4 colleagues, including myself, who hasn't published the reconstruction of the Gospel, because after I had read those of those colleagues, I thought there's no point in producing a 5th one. So my view was, look at where do these 4 attempts overlap. I'm so sorry for my computer. Where do those 4 overlap, and where are the differences? And it's quite easy to see. There is, I'd say, more than 90%, if not 95%, overlap in those 4 presentations of Marcion's Gospel when it comes to the texts that, for example, Matthias Klinghardt, like Dieter Roth, has put or have put in a bold font, which shows that this is text which is attested for Marcion's text by the main witnesses, which are, and who are, Tertullian, first of all, in his commentary on the Gospel of Marcion, and then Epiphanius, who has even a Greek text in front of him and gives us Greek text, not just Latin as Tertullian does. And then we have a few more of witnesses who are less important than these 2 main witnesses. Now, if we look at the text where Matthias Klinghardt, just like Dieter Roth and Jason Bedoun and Mark Bilby, state that these are texts which are witnessed, there is very little disagreement, because these witnesses are so clear in many ways. Then we have slight differences because sometimes the witnesses contradict each other. So here's a problem, and here some of the decisions that have been made by the editors, they differ. But it's all transparent, because as of a critical text, you have in the footnotes always the reasons why these editors then differ in their opinion, and you yourself can make up your own mind. So what's given is a secured text, and then some variations where not just the witnesses vary, but also the editors. So this is the secured part, and this is the most important part. Then comes, of course, a section of verses which are neither attested to be there in Marcion's text, nor are they attested that they are absent, because we have also, our witnesses tell us that certain areas and certain passages and verses were missing in Marcion's text compared to Luke's gospel. That's the reference text, because that's the closest with which all these witnesses compare Marcion's text. Epiphanius speaks even of a kind of a mirror text, so that we can have a clear understanding what Marcion's text was, except for the variations and except for those texts that are missing. Now, these are the areas which are pretty secured. Now comes the most difficult part. And this is where only, one has to say, the major differences also of the editors come up. Namely, those verses where none of the witnesses tell us that the verses were there, nor do the witnesses tell us that the verses are absent. And this is a gray area, and that's the most important one. Now, in the past, with Harnack and Zahn and Hilgenfeld in the 19th century, and Harnack even in the 20th century, they have more or less taken those not attested verses to be present in Marcion's gospel and also in his Pauline letters, unless they saw a theological difference. So theology, as Harnack put it down in his famous book on Marcion, theology was the key, not the only, but the key decision-making criteria. Whether one would attribute texts which have no witness, not for and not against, where people would attribute these texts to Marcion's gospel and Pauline letters or not. And this was heavily criticized, not just by Schmidt, not just by Dieter Roth and by Eve Marie Becker and by many, many other people. Because one saw in this kind of argument a circular argument by saying, well, we first have an idea of what Marcion theology is about, and then we reconstruct his gospel so that at the end it becomes a Marcionite gospel. And that was certainly a right criticism, and the reason for which people have become reluctant and were looking for other criteria. Now, the most important criterion Dieter Roth, for example, added to the discussion, well, it was already Clabaut who added this, but Dieter Roth developed it really, was the idea that we need to look into the habits of our witnesses, how they would normally quote biblical texts. And if they quote usually a biblical text exactly the way they would suggest when they were talking in their books about Marcion's text, then these witnesses are less secured. As if when Tertullian makes a comment about Marcion's text, he gives a different text from the way he always, in other of his books, and we have quite a number of books of him, in his books would refer to the same verse. So that's what scribal habits are. And if Tertullian and Epiphanius, for example, differ in their scribal habit by quoting a verse by Marcion, then there is a certain security given that verses which are quoted differently are not in the canonical text, but in the Marcionite text. So that was one criterion, a very important one. The second criterion had been developed by Jason Bedun and by Matthias Klinghardt, and none of the others. And that was argumentative coherence. They both recognized that Marcion's texts and Marcion's New Testament was not a testament of fragments, but was a testament which had a gospel as a full narrative and letters which were letters and not just fragments of letters. And so they were trying to see whether from the attested verses that we have from Tertullian and Epiphanius, we could develop on the basis of the canonical texts, Luke's text, and Paul, the canonical Paul's text, whether we can develop a kind of a narrative so that we can fill in those gray areas with text to make sense that these are texts of a gospel and texts of letters. To be transparent, both Jason Bedun as well as Matthias Klinghardt have put this text in a different script. Jason Bedun puts them always in brackets so that we know. Just when we look at the papyrus who has been reconstructed, we can see the papyrus text is in the normal script, and everything where the editors, to make sense of a papyrus and to be able to translate it, they put additional text which is not on the papyrus visible, but these texts they put into brackets. Or when you go to an exhibition of an archaeological site, you will see a red line which the archaeologists put on in a wall. And then you know exactly. So the secured visibility of the wall is under the red line. And from where the red line is, on top of that, it's reconstruction. It's guess. It's what the archaeologists suggest it might have been, because it was a wall and not just 2 or 20 centimeters of a wall. Yeah, it must have been a house. So this is reconstructive work in history. It's not guesswork simply. So there is a rationale behind, yeah, but it is still reconstructive part. Why do I recount all of that history? It is the precondition of the work which I was then doing. I started with reconstructing the Greek text of the Pauline letters, and that is not done until today. Nobody has done it. Yeah. So when I started doing that, I started from exactly the position of the previous reconstructors or editors of Marcion's Gospel. And I just wanted to do the work which hasn't been done for the letters of Paul. Within a few months, or let's say 1.5 years of work, I discovered that with the gray area, and that's the most problematic part, yeah, I discovered with the gray area, so verses which are neither attested for Marcion's version nor attested as absent. This gray area, we can distinguish language and grammar and text in it, because we can see, and I noticed that very, very often, that I was checking whether the text could have been, because of the narrative structure of a letter, whether the text could have been part of the Marcionite version or not. I discovered that every now and then, when I was checking either words or grammar or constructions, these constructions which I found in those verses which were gray, I only discovered that the language in these verses and all the other features, so the semantic, for example, so the whole lexicography, only appears in those canonical parts which are said to have been absent from the Marcionite version. That was a key moment where I discovered how important semantics and lexic is. Or to put it very simple, I take an example, right? When it comes to the word diaconia, you would have thought it's such an obvious word, which appears throughout the canonical texts. You would also have it in the Marcionite text. In the gray area text, yes, we have it. But it only and exclusively appears in the canonical parts. Never in those parts which are mentioned to be present. They only appear in those verses where our witnesses tell us that these verses are absent, or in the gray areas. And I have a number of similar, even more profane examples than diaconia. We have verb forms which appear over 600 times in the New Testament, which are only present in verses which are said to be absent from Marcion's texts, be it in the Gospel, be it in the 10 letters of Paul, and only appear then at best in the gray areas. And these are then hints for me to say, well, these gray areas where these words appear have either been rewritten by the canonical redactors or are part of the canonical redaction. And you can see this presupposes, of course, two things. One, that the canonical New Testament is a later redaction of an earlier Marcionite one. Because second, if you think that you could have taken a verb form out of a text, a canonical text, if you had redacted a text, this is absurd. You cannot take 600 times a nonsensical, profane verb form out of a text just because you redact the text. Nobody would have done that. Nobody could have done it, actually, right? So this is a non-starter. So that gave a solid basis for the previous assumption that the canonical redaction is a later redaction of an earlier text, because it doesn't happen the other way around. It only happens this way. Now, then, knowing that the lexicography and the semantics are so important for making decisions about a gray area for which we have, except for the narrative and the argument, if we discount the theology, which I have discounted. So if we only look into the text themselves, into the logic of a text, and into the grammar and semantics, then we need a concordance which gives us a comparison to know which words are attested for the Marcionite texts and which words are attested for the canonical texts. And that is the reason why, for the first years, I've worked on the concordance. And so I've taken all of the words, so all the different lemmata, all the different words, and also all of the places where these words appear in the canonical New Testament. That's the basis. And these are over 5,500 words, as we know, different words that the canonical New Testament comprises. And then I've checked every word of these 5,500 and listed them where they appear in the canonical New Testament. That's quite easy because we have concordances. The more difficult part was I then compared each of these words. Where do they appear, if they appear? Where do they appear, if they appear? In the Marcionite texts. And the concordance, which I have done published last year, only lists the secured texts. So this is, and we have about 8,000. We have about 8,000 words in total, but not different words. Yeah. So we have of these 8,000 words as a total word count. Yeah, of the Marcionite text compared to about 25,000 of the canonical text. Just to give you the references, but with this attested about 8,000 words in total, I have then checked where do these different words appear. And I do not reckon any gray area. So this is only attested material. And here you can see first very interesting observation when you just look into the concordance. Every so often you have words which are attested for the gospel that reappear in Marcion's collection of Paul's letters. And an enormous amount of words are from the canonical texts are absent, not just for the canonical gospel, for the pre-canonical gospel, for Marcion's gospel, but also for Marcion's letters of Paul. So there is a certain convergence. Of course, naturally, you would have reckoned also there are differences because the letters have a different narrative than the gospel has. Yeah, that's for sure. So the concordance is a tool where you can have the attested vocabulary that Marcion's texts have, and you can compare them with the canonical lexicography that we have in our text. And I tell you, the experience I make when colleagues look into the concordance, they see quite quickly an enormous difference with regards to the types of word that we have in the Marcionite texts compared to the types of words that we have in the canonical texts. So far for that. Now, that was the basis. And on that basis, I then also started working on the reconstruction of Paul's letters. And if we just can have the older slide, the first slide again. Thanks, Jack. In doing that work, I was extremely lucky, not only to have Jack as my former student, who now has a good PhD and a job, but I have also met colleagues who are specialists in lexicography, in semantic, and in semantic comparisons. Most brilliantly, colleagues who are strong in computer science. Because when I did it for 10, 15 years, I worked on pencil or laptop. And I had to check out every word wherever it appears, every form wherever it appeared, just by hand. And I had to check whether the attested texts that are given in the various reconstructions were actually the text that I read in these witnesses. So all of that has gone into the concordance. But without the help and the support of Jack, of course, and then of Mark Bilby and Lance Lothrop, that project wouldn't have been done and not completed. And that's the reason why the new work, which first is going to appear in German next year, hopefully, and then is going to be translated into English, because as you can see, we have a 3 volumes work. So we have an almost 600 to 800 pages introduction. And then we have 2 roughly 600 to 800 pages, volume 2 and volume 3, with a reconstruction and the translation of the 10 Pauline letters as we have them reconstructed in the Marcionite text. And in the translation, we give a comparison between the Marcionite translated text and the canonical text, so that we have a quick insight into where the differences and the parallels are. So far for the project. And that's why it's authored not just by myself, but by all 4 of us. So it's a teamwork. It's a teamwork, as all Marcionite work until now has merged into a teamwork, which doesn't mean we all are of the same opinion, yeah? But we are working towards our common goal and try to discuss those opinions where we might have differences or different views. Now, what Jack and me are intending to do over the next weeks or days is to present each of the Pauline letters step by step, take you through where are the gray areas? Where are the attested areas? Where are the gray areas? And why do we think the Marcionite text looks as we have reconstructed it? Of course, we don't take you through every verse. That's impossible. I think that would take us some more time than just an hour a week. No, but what we would like to do is, and now for the next slide, we would like to show you first always a survey of the structure of both versions of the letters, and then take you through the most important elements that these letters show us, both in the Marcionite version and also in the canonical version. And then you can see pretty quickly the difference between the two. And I think over time, you will see also there are patterns. And these patterns are very important because they show us patterns how important the Marcionite collection was, and how important also the canonical collection was. And you will see how they depend on each other. Even more so, we will come here also quite soon, probably today even, to the insight that both editorial work have not been done independently. The canonical depend on Marcion's, but Marcion, we learn today, also depends on the canonical tradition, which complicates a bit our picture of one side heresy, a second side orthodoxy. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for the 2nd century, as we will see. And we will learn from there that there is an interaction between the two sides. But now I've said enough. I keep my mouth shut for a moment and see where Jack is coming in.
Yeah, well, it was a pleasure because I was the editor of Mark Bilby's translation of Marcus's reconstruction. And it was only really, as I mentioned on the channel before, with the comparison of the two texts side by side that one can really start to see both the differences between the styles, the themes, the theologies, but then also, as Marcus has alluded to a couple of times already, the lexic and stylometric things that on a first glance one wouldn't necessarily take in. And so, although it's certainly the case that where the texts do agree, they are fascinating. It's almost unbelievable in the places where they disagree. And I'm sure Marcus could explain this slide better than I in a moment. But even when we just take, and this is the letter we're focusing on for this episode, the letter to the Galatians, we can already begin to see many differences, and particularly, I think, on this first slide, narrative elements that are different across the two letters. So if we just begin towards the top, we can see we get a prescript, and then this difference in chapter 1 between the excursus, the surrender to God, and excursus, the curse. But I'm always fascinated in, particularly from looking more at hagiographies and stories of martyrdoms and other narrative elements in particular texts, in this propensity of redactors and later interpolators to give story, to embellish and create wonderful sort of myth, if that's the right word, around certain characters and figures. And so we see the same too in the Evangelion, with the lack of infancy narratives, which are then builded upon in Matthew and Luke. We see the same with Jesus' travels, and also too with Paul's travels. Paul is a much less travelled, mythologized man in the Apostolos compared to what he is in the canonical text. And so we only need to look here into passages that we are very familiar with, I think, of those who studied Paul. So his travels to Arabia and Damascus, after 3 years of journey to Jerusalem, a journey to Syria and Sicily. After 14 years of traveling to Jerusalem, it then links back up with the canonical text. So we get lots more of this sort of discussion about what Paul has been up to, where he's been and what he's done. And to some extent, we get that with Acts as well, right? These stories that Paul has. And indeed, if we're right that Acts is also a 2nd century text, then it makes sense that people are mythologizing and creating around Paul around the same time. And so those big differences I find fascinating, but then we also get the slightly smaller, more intricate things that I think also provide a big insight. So for example, and perhaps Marcus might want to speak about this as he knows more than I do on the subject, but we see there Peter and Paul in Jerusalem, in Galatians, in the Apostolos. But then on the other side, we get not Peter by that name, but Cephas and Paul, this time now in Antioch. So there's geographical differences. There are personal, or at least name differences, and how we look at these figures. And just before I hand back to Marcus, a comment on the geography. I also think it's really interesting in the way in which that Marcion orders these texts. Again, canonical readers will be familiar with going from biggest to smallest, start with the great Magnus Opum of Romans and moving forward to Philemon. But there's something particularly special about Marcion's in that he tries to place them in a canonical order, a chronological order, one that tries to follow the life and ordering of Paul's missions. And so when we get sort of these smaller differences and geographical differences, back to Marcus's point about benign things, it seems strange to me that we would move the place of Jerusalem to Antioch, well, or in the opposite case, Antioch to Jerusalem. And Marcus, maybe you could speak into that. Why these sorts of changes? Why would that be interesting of the canonical redactor to move Peter and Paul from in Jerusalem to Cephas and Paul, but now in Antioch?
Yeah, happy to do so. Let's just stay with this kind of an overview. First of all, what you see in front of you is on the left hand with the star. This is always the row of the Marcionite version. So to give it as part of the 10-letter collection, because we know only 10 of Pauline letters are part of the Marcionite collection. So missing are the pastoral letters 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, and missing is Hebrews. Whereas on the right side, where you have Galatians, Gal without the star, this is the structure of the canonical text. What you can see here, and you will see even better if we are a bit further in the letters, you will discover that Galatians is the letter which, if we compare the Marcionite and the canonical one of the closest. So this is a letter which has been relatively little altered by the canonical redactors. We will see quite quickly there are passages that have been changed, but compared to, let's say, Romans or 2 Corinthians, this canonical redaction is pretty close to the Marcionite text. So that gives us a very first insight, very important insight. The Marcionite texts have been taken extremely serious by the canonical redactors. So they don't seem to see these texts as non-reliable. They're not happy with everything in these texts, but for them, this text is the Pauline basis for them. What they do, as we will see, they will make slight alterations. I give you a short statement by a New Testament scholar who is called Lührmann, Dieter Lührmann, quite an important scholar in Germany, who has written about Galatians. And he gives the following text on our letter, or the canonical letter of Galatians, where he says, for those people who read Galatians first, they must have noticed the change of handwriting as soon as they have read through the letter, because Paul had written the last lines of this letter, as he says in the canonical text, in his own hand. And that's what we read in Galatians 6:11-18. And once again, he says, briefly summarizing what Paul thought was at stake, and then concluding with a blessing, but admittedly without adding any personal greetings to anyone in Galatia. No greeting, he states, even from one of those who were with Paul, apparently, in Galatia at that time. And when we then skim the letter from the beginning, we could see that after the usual beginning of a letter in Paul's letters, here in Galatians, Paul did not start with a thank you, but instead addressed his addressees sharply. It is interesting to see everything which Lührmann takes as specific for Galatians and unspecific for canonical Paul is specific for the Marcionite letters and unspecific for the canonical redactors. Just to repeat that again for a good understanding. So what Lührmann discovers is at odds in Galatians, is at odds with canonical Paul, but is typical for the Marcionite Paul. And that's why I'm saying the canonical Galatians, that's the first indication that the direction of alteration is not a reduction of the canonical text by Marcion, but a reduction of the Marcionite text by the canonical texts. So let's start with the oddities, yeah? That Paul in Galatians is not saying thank you to the Galatians, is not an oddity. In none of the other letters is the Marcionite Paul ever thanking the addressees. It doesn't appear. But it appears, except for Galatians, in all of the canonical texts. Likewise, that at the end in Galatians, nobody is being greeted is exactly what you will find in all of Paul's, Marcionite Paul's letters. So the pre-canonical Paul doesn't know of greetings at the end of letters. And Galatians doesn't have it either. This is so interesting because in the canonical revision of Galatians, in the beginning, although Paul is the only author of Galatians, he still has a reminiscence that he is addressing people not just by himself, but also by the community. When we read canonical Galatians in the beginning, you will see that he says of himself, yes, Paul the apostle, not by humans, not through humans, and so forth. But then we have a second verse, and all the brothers that are with him who write to the people in Galatia. And here you can see these people disappear, because at the end there's no greetings to anybody and not by anybody. It's just Paul himself. And you can see there's discrepancy in the canonical revision. They add these brothers who are not mentioned in the Marcionite Paul. They add these brothers, as they have added in most of the other letters, co-authors, Sosthenes, Timothy, brothers, and so forth. This is a typical feature which we will see again and again in the canonical revisions of the pre-canonical texts. In the pre-canonical texts, the Marcionite Paul is exclusive. He is the only one who writes these letters, and he has nobody with him. None. Always alone. And hence, no greetings. In the canonical Galatians, we have this tension and the discrepancy that we have these brothers who send with Paul the letter, but they are not mentioned at the end. Let's look a bit more closely into the structure of Galatians in these two versions. So after the prescript, as we call it, it's the foreword, which are, just as I said, slightly expanded on the canonical text with the introduction of these brothers, we then have a opening address, if you like, an ex ordium, we call it in the terms of literature. So this is the opening, if you like. And the opening is the introduction of the main topic of the text. It's all about this other gospel that Paul complains quite quickly that the Galatians have moved away from the gospel that he has delivered to them. It's not clear, at least by reading it, whether he means a written gospel or whether he means just the message of the gospel. It is interesting that we have then a slight variation between the pre-canonical and the canonical text when it comes to this excursus in verses 8 and 9. Because the canonical text has a curse, anathema est. So whoever follows this other gospel is being, anathema. We quite often translate it as excluded from the church, or banned, or whatever. We have the same word in the pre-canonical already, but anathema in those times, in late antiquity, does not necessarily be a curse, but it also can mean it is surrendering to God. It is handing over to God. And from the way Tertullian discusses it, he complains that Marcion doesn't understand that as a curse. And that's the reason why I think we have a semantic difference in and with regards to these verses. More important is then when we move a bit on in the letter. Then comes what we call the narratio, so the real story. I mean, now what happens, And we have a long section, you can see in the canonical text, which goes from verse 112 to 214. And here we are told what happened before the revelation, before the apocalypse. And Paul talks about that he was persecuting the community. And you will see we have it in both versions. But the canonical text then adds, as Jack has already indicated, adds to the story. Because the Marcionite Paul stops there. But the canonical text carries on. And they mention that Paul has then traveled to Arabia after the apocalypse, after he had been facing Christ. And then close to Damascus he was. And then comes the first journey, which he was supposed to have done. After 3 years, we are told, he then traveled to Jerusalem. And after the meeting there, he went to Syria and to Cilicia. You can imagine how we might ask why. Why is the canonical tradition introducing these voyages? And of course, when you think that in the canonical collection, we not only have Paul's letters, who hardly give us all these travels. even not indications, except sometimes in the canonical version. But in the same collection of the canonical New Testament, we have the book of Acts. And the book of Acts portrays Paul, who becomes from chapter 8 onwards the main protagonist of this book. This book gives us a portrait of Paul, who is the tourist, missionary tourist, who is traveling. He is even not somebody who writes. More important, he is preaching. He is journeying from place to place. And all these places that you find here in the additional text of the canonical version, you will re-find in canonical Acts. So this is a first indication that the kind of rewriting of Acts was once a reconnecting with the book of Acts, was an attempt to link canonical Galatians with canonical Acts. And so we have, be it that Acts depends on this canonical reduction, or whether this canonical reduction depends on Acts, that is something which we haven't figured out yet, because nobody has even done that kind of comparison, because nobody has seen that these verses are new compared to an older version of Galatians where all these verses were missing. So what one would need to do now in New Testament studies is to look at each of these verses compared to the pre-canonical version as additional text. And then we would need to discern, when was it likely that these verses were created? Is it more likely that these verses, these additional verses, are the basis for Acts? Or is it the other way around, that these verses are based on Acts? We will see there are discrepancies sometimes between Acts and these verses, but then there is most of the time a certain overlap. So what I'm saying is that we need to discern that we not only have two stages to compare, canonical Galatians, what's always been done when it comes to Galatians. People have always compared canonical Galatians with Acts and asked what kind of rewriting took place, what kind of an answer structure is in place, and so forth. But now it's not canonical Acts and compared to canonical Galatians. It's within canonical Galatians, two layers, namely the layer that canonical Galatian is identical with a pre-canonical. So we have pre-canonical Galatians, then we have the additional texts in Galatians, and these need to be compared with Acts. So a totally new field of New Testament research, which hasn't even begun. Interestingly, when we compare these journeys, there is only one journey of which pre-canonical Galatians tell us. And that is that after 14 years, so after 14 years that Paul had whichever revelation, he doesn't tell us exactly what and where the revelation took place. So Damascus is the reductional place that the canonical texts only give us, again, both in Acts and in the canonical text here. But pre-canonical Paul leaves it open. But what he says, and there you can see now that we're not mythicists, right? If these texts have some bearing, then even the pre-canonical Paul must have thought of the apocalypse not just as a daydream. Otherwise, he couldn't have said after 14 years. So there is a time sensitivity. And if you have a certain time when you had a revelation, you had a certain location for a revelation. So it's not an ongoing dreamer. He can fix it in his head. He knew where and when it was. We don't know. That's our problem. But the text doesn't tell us. So, but after 14 years, he was traveling to Jerusalem. And he also says he meets there Peter. But he also meets the other apostles, and he mentions two. So it's James, or he mentions one, James. But we can assume that there might have also been John, if he talks about three, or more than one, and more than two. So we assume he meets those three. And then in chapter 2, verses 11 to 14, he gives us this row between Paul and Peter, where he mentions that Peter is a turnaround, a turncoat. First he sides with Paul, and then Paul sees him withdrawing. Why? Because, as we all know, it had to do with eating with uncircumcised members of the community. It is in the pre-canonical text of interest that this type of a confrontation between Paul and Peter and Paul does not take place in a different city. It was Mark Bilby who had discovered that the confrontation in the pre-canonical Paul takes place in Jerusalem. And this already gives us an explanation why the canonical redactors have moved this confrontation from Jerusalem to Antioch. Why? Because in the pre-canonical Paul, it is the Jerusalem community with the people from James with whom Peter sides. And it is, let's say, the disruption of the Jerusalem community between Peter on the one side with James and the brothers, and Paul on the other side, who is together with Titus, but except that, he's alone. So it's a much more confrontative narrative, which is at the heart of the Christian community in Jerusalem. The canonical redactors, and now you can see the proximity between canonical Acts and canonical Galatians. They remove this away from the Jerusalem community. It's a local conflict in the Pauline community, not in the James and Peter community in Jerusalem. It's in the Pauline community where he grew up and lived for years. It's his problem, not the core problem of Christians. It's a typical Pauline problem. So it's a removal of the whole business of disruption, and it's shouldered on Paul rather than on Peter, James, and John. And that's the narrative which we get in Acts, and that's the narrative we even get in canonical Galatians. When it comes then to the theology in 2:16-18, we read, a man is not justified by deeds according to the law, but by faith alone. And you can see the same you will find also in the canonical tradition, here even more supported with more back information.
Before you move on, Marcus, if I may, why the difference between Peter and Cephas? Where's this name difference coming from? We understand, you've explained why Jerusalem and Antioch may be different, but where does the Apostolos peel Peter out of compared to the canonical Cephas?
The only, I thought about it a lot. We have Cephas appearing here and there, even in the pre-canonical one, but not in most places, yeah? The explanation that I have, and I have to admit, whenever I say I have to admit it, it's guesswork, yeah? So it's a potential explanation. It's not a secured one. It's a hypothesis. But I do think the hypothesis is that the Marcionite texts have not only been produced by somebody who has a didaskalion, a school place, which he's running in Rome. He has also, presumably, for many years collaborated with the Roman and even the Roman army, but also potentially also with the Roman emperor's household. He is much more a Romanist than he is just a Greek Jew. Of course, Sinope is a center for both the Roman army, but also for Greek studies of Jews. The correction of the Septuagint is done, one of the corrections is done by a contemporary of Marcion in Sinope, so in northern Turkey. One of the most famous reductions of the Septuagint. Marcion must have had a very good Greek training. So he is part of the Greek Jewish community there. But likewise, I think, with his running of the ship business, he must have had very close relations to Roman-speaking people. And his narrative is in many ways, as we will see throughout these discussions, is more a Roman one than the canonical one. So my guess is that the canonical redaction has been done in Asia Minor, in a Greek Jewish Christian community. Whereas I think the Marcionite version reflects more of a Latin background. And Petrus, as you know, is the Latin version of the name. Cephas is the Greek one. Both means stone. And it appears from the manuscripts that we have that both the Gospel of Marcion and also the 10-letter collection was simultaneously produced in both languages, in Greek and in Latin. And so it might be an inflection of the Latin tradition that reflects more in the Marcionite text because of these bilinguality of the edition and of the publication that he was doing. Because those codices out of the Pauline codices that we have, which are closest to Marcion's version, they are all bilinguals. So the bilinguality seems to have been another typical feature of the Marcionite edition of the New Testament. That's the way I could explain that. But it's a hypothesis. We don't have anything else except for these circumstantial reflections. Yeah, then we have these informations in 2:16-18 that a man is not justified by deeds according to the law, but by faith alone, which I think is a first very important statement. Yeah. And compared and combined with it is, of course, that Paul speaks about himself, which is pretty rare in the pre-canonical texts, which is recurrent in the canonical Pauline text. So in Galatians, he says, well, I belonged even to Judaism and I was persecuting the church. Yeah, I was even very engaged with the traditions of my fathers. But then, apparently, he was selected by Christ in order to preach the gospel. And here you can see this, for the canonical texts, was the cliffhanger. To have this note of, or the small biographical note that we have in the pre-canonical text, out of which then the canonical text develops a huge story. And if we then come into the next part, the Galatians have been blended. 3:1. What do we get in the canonical text. We get a whole explanation why these people have been blended. Well, here we hear it's the Spirit. And most importantly, it's the question of Abraham. Abraham is being introduced in those first verses of the 3rd chapter. And we will see Abraham is running through the canonical letters. He appears very, very centrally in Romans again, but also here. And we will see Abraham even plays or has a place in the pre-canonical text. But I'd love to develop that question further in our next session, because then we will go into the core, in the theological core of Galatians, which is chapters 3 and 4. And we will see how different, and here comes a real difference between the pre-canonical vision of what the church is and what belief is and what the law is, and how the canonical redactors deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And if you are interested in continuing this series, then don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, check out our Patreons and Twitter down in the description. And in addition, just one more, if I may. Marcus has written a fantastic novel and is currently doing a reading of it over on his YouTube channel for free. So if that's something that interests you and you're already fascinated by his work with Marcion, I guarantee he's just as much as a novelist as he is a historian and biblical theologian. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.